A brilliant mathematician sits by his fireplace on a cold winter morning in 1619, staring into the flames and questioning everything he has ever believed to be true. What if mathematics is wrong? What if his senses deceive him about everything? What if an evil demon is manipulating his mind right now? This moment of radical doubt would reshape how humanity thinks about knowledge, reality, and consciousness forever. The man was René Descartes, and his revolutionary ideas still influence every corner of modern thought, from artificial intelligence to neuroscience to our understanding of what makes us human. But Descartes was far more than just a philosopher pondering abstract questions. He was a mathematician who invented coordinate geometry, linking algebra and spatial reasoning in ways that made calculus possible. He was a scientist who explained rainbows through optics, developed theories about planetary motion, and dissected animals to understand circulation. He was a psychologist before psychology existed, mapping out human emotions and their relationship to the body. Most remarkably, he was a systematic thinker who believed he could rebuild all human knowledge from the ground up, using nothing but reason and careful method. His project was breathtakingly ambitious: to establish absolutely certain foundations for mathematics, science, ethics, medicine, and metaphysics. He wanted to end the endless debates between ancient authorities by showing how any rational person could discover truth through systematic thinking. While his complete system ultimately failed in ways he never anticipated, the questions he asked and the methods he developed created the intellectual framework for the modern world. Every time a scientist demands empirical evidence, every time a philosopher questions basic assumptions, every time we wonder about the relationship between mind and brain, we are following paths that Descartes first carved out. Part 1. The Architecture of Universal Doubt. Descartes did not begin with doubt because he was naturally skeptical, but because he was desperately seeking certainty in an intellectual world torn apart by religious wars, competing authorities, and the collapse of medieval scholasticism. Imagine living in an era where Catholic and Protestant scholars cited the same biblical passages to reach opposite conclusions, where Aristotelian physics was crumbling under new astronomical discoveries, and where ancient medical texts were being contradicted by actual dissection of human corpses. This was the epistemological crisis that shaped Descartes' generation. How can we know anything for certain when every authority contradicts every other authority? The genius of Descartes' approach was to realize that this crisis could become an opportunity. Rather than choosing between competing authorities, he would reject the entire concept of knowledge based on authority and create a method for discovering truth that any rational person could follow. But first, he had to clear away the intellectual debris of centuries of accumulated beliefs, assumptions, and half-truths. This required a form of doubt more systematic and comprehensive than anything previously attempted in human thought. His method of universal doubt unfolded in carefully orchestrated stages, each designed to test a different foundation of human knowledge. The first stage attacked what philosophers call empirical knowledge, anything we claim to know through sensory experience. But Descartes was not content with pointing out obvious sensory illusions like bent sticks in water or distant objects appearing smaller than they are. He developed a sophisticated analysis of why sense experience is systematically unreliable as a foundation for certain knowledge. Consider the deeper philosophical problem. Your senses only give you information about how things appear to you under specific conditions, not about how things actually are in themselves. When you see a red apple, Your visual system is responding to certain wavelengths of reflected light, but the redness exists in the interaction between the apple, the light, and your nervous system. The apple itself, apart from any observer, has no color properties at all. This means that sensory experience always involves a subjective component that cannot be separated from whatever objective reality might exist. Therefore, the senses cannot provide direct access to objective truth about the world. But Descartes pushed this sensory skepticism to genuinely disturbing extremes through what he called the dreaming argument. The philosophical sophistication of this argument is often missed in simple summaries. Descartes was not just pointing out that dreams can be vivid, but rather analyzing the logical structure of how we justify claims to knowledge. Every time you claim to know something through experience, you are implicitly claiming to be awake and alert rather than dreaming or hallucinating. But this raises a logical problem. What evidence could you possibly give for being awake that could not itself be part of a dream? Think about this more carefully than you probably ever have before. Right now you feel completely certain that you are awake, processing real information, existing in the actual world. But you have almost certainly had dreams where you felt exactly this same certainty, only to discover upon waking that the entire experience was illusory. If subjective certainty cannot distinguish waking from dreaming while you are in either state, then subjective certainty is worthless as a criterion for knowledge. This means that all empirical knowledge, no matter how compelling it feels, rests on an assumption that cannot itself be empirically verified. The dreaming argument reveals something profound about the structure of empirical justification. When scientists observe experimental results, when historians examine documents, when doctors diagnose patients, they all assume they are dealing with real phenomena rather than dream experiences. But this assumption cannot be justified empirically without circular reasoning. You cannot use empirical evidence to prove that empirical evidence is reliable, any more than you can use a broken ruler to measure whether the ruler is actually broken. This exposes what philosophers call the problem of the criterion. We need criteria for knowledge to identify knowledge, but we need knowledge to establish reliable criteria. Yet even this was not radical enough for Descartes' most devastating skeptical scenario. The evil demon hypothesis represents perhaps the most psychologically disturbing thought experiment in the history of human thinking. Descartes imagined a being of supreme power and intelligence whose sole purpose is to deceive him about absolutely everything. This is not merely a stronger version of the dreaming argument, but a qualitatively different challenge that attacks the foundations of rational thought itself. The evil demon could manipulate not just sensory experiences, but the very structure of logical reasoning. When you think that 2 + 3 = 5, the demon could be making you experience a feeling of logical certainty about a mathematical falsehood. When you follow what seems like a valid logical argument, the demon could be systematically corrupting your reasoning processes so that invalid inferences feel compelling and valid inferences feel absurd. The demon scenario is so comprehensive that it challenges not just particular beliefs but the entire apparatus of human cognition. What makes this skeptical scenario philosophically profound rather than merely paranoid is its logical structure. Descartes was not suggesting that an evil demon actually exists, but rather using this as a thought experiment to test the logical foundations of knowledge claims. Any belief that could survive even this impossible scenario would have to be absolutely, unshakably certain. The demon hypothesis functions like a philosophical stress test, applying maximum pressure to see which ideas have the logical strength to support the entire edifice of human knowledge. This reveals the mathematical inspiration behind Descartes' philosophical method. In geometry, you begin with axioms that are self-evidently true, and then derive all other truths through logical demonstration. Descartes wanted to find philosophical axioms with the same kind of absolute certainty as geometric axioms. Just as geometric proofs remain valid regardless of what you might dream or imagine, philosophical truths should be immune to any possible skeptical challenge. The evil demon scenario was designed to identify ideas with this kind of logical invulnerability. But the deeper significance of methodical doubt lies in what it reveals about the nature of knowledge itself. Descartes discovered that most of what we call knowledge consists of interconnected webs of assumptions that we never explicitly examine. We assume that other minds exist, that the past actually happened as we remember it, that the external world continues to exist when we are not observing it, that our cognitive faculties are generally reliable. These assumptions are so basic that questioning them feels almost insane. Yet, from a purely logical standpoint, they are assumptions rather than demonstrated truths. The methodical doubt also exposed what philosophers now call the transparency problem of consciousness. When you introspect your own mental states, you seem to have direct, immediate access to your thoughts and feelings. But Descartes realized that this apparent immediacy could itself be systematically deceptive. The evil demon could create the illusion of introspective access while actually controlling every aspect of your mental life. This suggests that even self-knowledge, which seems like the most secure form of knowledge possible, might rest on questionable assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and its objects. Furthermore, the doubt revealed the problem of criteria that would later become central to epistemology. In order to know anything, you need some way of distinguishing true beliefs from false ones. But how do you know that your criteria for truth are themselves reliable? If you test your criteria against what you take to be clear cases of knowledge, you are reasoning in a circle. If you try to justify your criteria by appeal to other criteria, you face an infinite regress. Descartes' methodical doubt was designed to find a starting point that could break out of this circle by being so certain that it needed no external justification. The psychological dimension of following Descartes through this process cannot be underestimated. Methodical doubt is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a form of philosophical therapy that dissolves the false confidence we normally have in our beliefs. Most people live their entire lives without seriously entertaining the possibility that their most basic convictions might be completely wrong. Descartes forced his readers to confront the logical possibility that everything they had ever believed, including their capacity for logical thought itself, might be systematically deceptive. This creates a kind of existential vertigo that strips away every familiar landmark of human experience. Yet this destruction served a profoundly constructive purpose in Descartes' overall philosophical project. By clearing away everything that could possibly be false, he hoped to discover indubitable truths that could serve as axioms for rebuilding human knowledge on secure foundations. The doubt was not an end in itself, but a means to an end, the establishment of a philosophical system with the certainty and systematic completeness of mathematics. Like a master architect who tears down a structurally unsound building to construct something magnificent and permanent, Descartes was preparing the ground for what he hoped would be the final philosophical system. Part 2. The Cogito Discovery. From the wasteland of universal doubt, Descartes made what may be the most famous philosophical discovery in human history. But the Cogito argument is far more subtle and powerful than most people realize, and its implications extend far beyond the simple statement, "I think, therefore I am." Understanding the Cogito properly requires grasping both its logical structure and its revolutionary significance for how we understand consciousness, knowledge, and personal identity. The genius of the Cogito lies in its unique logical status. Unlike every other belief that Descartes had subjected to methodical doubt, the Cogito is what philosophers call performatively self-verifying. This means that the very act of doubting it proves that it is true. Even the most powerful evil demon cannot deceive you into believing that you exist if you do not actually exist, because the deception itself requires something that can be deceived. The Cogito is not just immune to skeptical doubt, but actually gains strength from it. The more radically you doubt, the more certain your existence as a doubting thing becomes. But what exactly does the Cogito establish? This question is more complex than it initially appears and reveals the sophisticated philosophical analysis underlying Descartes' seemingly simple insight. The Cogito does not prove that you have a physical body, that other people exist, that the external world is real, or even that you existed a moment ago or will exist a moment from now. It establishes only that something is thinking right now, and that this thinking thing must exist in order to do the thinking. Consider the precision of this claim. When Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," he is not making an inference from thinking to existence as if these were two separate facts. Rather, he is recognizing that thinking and the existence of a thinking thing are logically inseparable. You cannot coherently conceive of thinking occurring without something that thinks, any more than you can conceive of walking occurring without something that walks. The Cogito reveals not a causal relationship, but a logical necessity built into the very concept of thought. This logical structure makes the Cogito different from all other existential claims. When you assert that your body exists, you are making a claim that could be false if you are dreaming or being deceived by an evil demon. When you assert that other people exist, you are making an inference from external behavior to internal mental states that could be mistaken. But when you assert that you exist as a thinking thing, you are not making an inference at all. You are simply recognizing what is already contained in the act of thinking itself. This makes the Cogito what philosophers call analytically true rather than empirically discovered. The revolutionary implications of this discovery become clear when we consider what Descartes meant by thinking. He used the Latin word cogitatio to include not just intellectual reasoning, but every form of conscious mental activity. Doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, willing, refusing, imagining, and sensing. Whenever you are conscious of anything at all, you are thinking in Descartes' technical sense. This means that the Cogito establishes not just that some abstract thinking substance exists, but that you exist as a conscious being with a rich inner life of experiences, thoughts, and mental activities. But this raises profound questions about the nature of the self that the Cogito reveals. What exactly is this I that thinks and therefore exists? Descartes argued that the Cogito shows us that we are essentially thinking substances, not physical bodies that happen to think. The reasoning here is subtle but crucial. You can doubt the existence of your body while being certain of your existence as a thinking thing. What you can clearly and distinctly conceive as separate must be actually separable. Therefore, your essential nature as a thinking being is independent of your physical nature. This conclusion would prove to be one of the most controversial aspects of Cartesian philosophy. Critics have argued that Descartes confused epistemological claims about what we can know for certain with metaphysical claims about what actually exists. Just because you can doubt your body while being certain of your mind does not necessarily prove that mind and body are actually separate substances. You might be a unified being whose mental and physical aspects are so intimately connected that you cannot properly understand either in isolation. The cogito might reveal something about the structure of self-knowledge rather than the ultimate nature of the self. Nevertheless, Descartes believed that the cogito provided not just certainty about existence, but insight into the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The fact that consciousness is self-revealing in a way that no physical process can be suggests that mental phenomena have a unique ontological status. When you are conscious of being conscious, you are not observing yourself from the outside like a scientist studying a physical system. Rather, you are experiencing a kind of immediate self-presence that has no analogue in the physical world. This phenomenological dimension of consciousness, its inherent what-it-is-like quality, seems to resist explanation in purely mechanical terms. The cogito also established what would become known as the primacy of first-person authority in matters of consciousness. You have a kind of access to your own mental states that no outside observer, no matter how sophisticated their instruments, can duplicate. When you are in pain, you do not infer that you are in pain based on evidence. You directly experience the pain in a way that gives you infallible knowledge of your current conscious state. This creates what philosophers call the asymmetry between first-person and third-person approaches to consciousness. Science can study the neural correlates of consciousness from the outside, but it cannot access the subjective dimension of experience that the cogito reveals. Furthermore, the cogito established consciousness as the indubitable starting point for all philosophical reflection about knowledge, reality, and value. Whatever else might be uncertain, the reality of conscious experience itself cannot be coherently denied. This insight would profoundly influence subsequent philosophy, from the idealism of Berkeley and Hegel to the phenomenology of Husserl and the existentialism of Sartre. Even materialist philosophers who reject Descartes' dualistic conclusions must still account for why consciousness seems to have this unique epistemic status. The cogito poses what contemporary philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, explaining how subjective experience arises from objective physical processes. The discovery of the cogito also revealed something important about the relationship between skepticism and knowledge. Descartes showed that certain forms of knowledge actually become stronger under skeptical pressure rather than weaker. The cogito cannot be undermined by doubt because doubt itself presupposes the existence of a doubter. This suggests that some truths are not just resistant to skeptical challenge, but actually depend on skeptical reflection for their discovery. Without the methodical doubt, Descartes might never have realized the unique logical status of self-consciousness. The cogito thus demonstrates that philosophical skepticism, properly employed, can be a tool for discovering truth rather than merely destroying false beliefs. Part 3. The nature of the thinking self. Having established his own existence as a thinking thing, Descartes faced the crucial question of what kind of thing this thinking self actually is. This investigation would lead him to develop one of the most influential and controversial theories in the history of philosophy, the doctrine of substance dualism. But understanding this theory requires grasping the sophisticated metaphysical framework within which Descartes was working, and the logical steps that led him to his startling conclusions about the nature of mind and reality. Descartes began with what seemed like a straightforward analysis of the self revealed by the cogito. He knew with absolute certainty that he existed as something that thinks, doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, imagines, and perceives. But what was the essential nature of this thinking thing? To answer this question, Descartes employed what philosophers call the method of essential properties. If you can conceive of something existing without a particular property, then that property is not essential to its nature. Consider your relationship to your physical body. You can imagine losing your arms, legs, eyes, or any other body part while still remaining yourself. You can even imagine existing as a completely disembodied consciousness, perhaps as a soul after death, or as a mind uploaded to a computer. The fact that you can clearly and distinctly conceive of yourself existing without any particular physical properties suggests that physicality is not essential to your nature as the self revealed by the cogito. What you cannot conceive of is existing without thinking, because the attempt to think yourself as not thinking involves a performative contradiction. This led Descartes to conclude that he was essentially an immaterial thinking substance. But what exactly did he mean by substance? In the philosophical vocabulary of his time, a substance was something that exists independently, requiring nothing else for its existence except the general concurrence of God. Properties or attributes, by contrast, exist only as modifications of substances. Redness cannot exist by itself, but only as the redness of some red thing. Thinking, according to Descartes, is the principal attribute of mental substance, just as extension in space is the principal attribute of physical substance. This metaphysical framework led Descartes to develop his famous doctrine of two kinds of created substance. Mental substance, which he called res cogitans, or thinking stuff, has consciousness as its essential attribute and exists without spatial extension. Physical substance, called res extensa, or extended stuff, has spatial extension as its essential attribute and exists without consciousness. These two kinds of substance are not just different, but completely opposite in their fundamental characteristics. Mind is conscious but not spatial, while body is spatial but not conscious. This creates what philosophers call substance dualism, the view that reality consists of two fundamentally different kinds of stuff. The implications of this theory for understanding personal identity are profound and counterintuitive. According to Descartes, you are not a physical organism that happens to be conscious, but rather a mental substance that happens to be connected to a physical body. Your essential self, what makes you you, is your immaterial soul or mind. Your body is more like a very sophisticated piece of equipment that your mind uses to interact with the physical world. This means that you could, in principle, survive the complete destruction of your body as long as your mental substance continued to exist. Personal identity through time consists in the continued existence of the same thinking substance, not the continued existence of the same physical matter. But this raises puzzling questions about the relationship between mental and physical aspects of human experience. If mind and body are completely different kinds of substance, how do they manage to interact so intimately in normal human life? When you decide to raise your hand, how does an immaterial mental event cause a physical event in your brain and muscles? When you suffer a physical injury, how does a physical event cause an immaterial mental experience of pain? This interaction problem would become one of the most persistent challenges to Cartesian dualism. Descartes was acutely aware of this problem and proposed what seemed to him a reasonable solution. He suggested that mind and body interact through a small gland at the center of the brain, called the pineal gland. This gland was unique in being the only unpaired structure in an otherwise bilaterally symmetric brain, making it a plausible candidate for the seat of the unified soul. Descartes theorized that the mind could influence the flow of what he called animal spirits through the pineal gland, thereby controlling bodily movements. Similarly, physical events in the body could affect the position of the pineal gland, thereby causing mental sensations and perceptions. However, this solution only pushed the interaction problem back one level without really solving it. Even if the pineal gland is the location where mind and body interact, we still need to explain how an immaterial substance can influence a material gland. Critics argued that Descartes had not shown how interaction between fundamentally different kinds of substance was possible, but merely specified where this mysterious interaction supposedly occurred. The deeper conceptual problem remained: how can something with no spatial properties causally influence something with spatial properties? Nevertheless, Descartes' substance dualism had profound implications for how we understand consciousness, free will, and moral responsibility. If the mind is an immaterial substance operating according to different principles than the physical world, then mental events might not be subject to the mechanical laws that govern physical events. This could explain how human beings are capable of genuine free will in a world where physical events follow deterministic causal laws. Your decisions and choices originate in your immaterial mind, which is not part of the mechanical chain of physical causation. This makes you genuinely responsible for your actions in a way that would be impossible if you were merely a complex physical machine. The theory also provided a framework for understanding the unique features of conscious experience that seem to resist physical explanation. The qualitative aspects of consciousness, what philosophers now call qualia, appear to have no clear physical analogues. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of chocolate, seem to be irreducibly mental phenomena that cannot be captured in purely physical descriptions. Descartes' dualism suggests that these qualitative aspects belong to mental substance and therefore cannot be reduced to or explained in terms of physical processes. Consciousness involves a fundamentally different kind of reality than anything studied by physics or chemistry. Furthermore, substance dualism offered a scientific research program for understanding human nature. If mind and body are distinct substances, then they can be studied using different methods appropriate to their different natures. Physical aspects of human beings can be investigated using the mathematical and experimental methods appropriate to extended substance. Mental aspects require different methods based on introspection, rational reflection, and analysis of consciousness. This division of labor between physical and mental sciences would profoundly influence the development of psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind. However, Descartes' analysis of the thinking self also revealed deep puzzles about the unity and continuity of consciousness. If the mind is a simple, indivisible substance, how do we account for the complexity and diversity of mental life? You can simultaneously see, hear, remember, imagine, and reason about multiple things at once. How does a simple substance manage to have multiple simultaneous mental states? And if mental substance has no spatial parts, what accounts for the apparent spatial organization of mental imagery and perception? These questions would challenge subsequent philosophers to develop more sophisticated theories of the relationship between the unity of consciousness and the diversity of mental contents. Part 4. Clear and distinct ideas. Having established his own existence as a thinking substance, Descartes needed a criterion for distinguishing true from false ideas if he was going to rebuild knowledge on secure foundations. His solution was one of the most influential epistemological theories in the history of philosophy, the doctrine of clear and distinct ideas. But understanding this doctrine properly requires grasping both its logical structure and its ambitious scope, as Descartes believed it could provide infallible criteria for truth in mathematics, science, metaphysics, and even practical affairs. The doctrine emerged from Descartes' analysis of what made the cogito so certain. When he recognized that he existed as a thinking thing, this truth appeared to his mind with perfect clarity and distinctness. He could not doubt it, not because of external evidence or authority, but because of the inherent lucidity with which it presented itself to his rational intuition. This suggested that clarity and distinctness might be the marks of truth in general, not just in the special case of the cogito. If he could identify other ideas with the same degree of clarity and distinctness, he might be able to extend his circle of certain knowledge beyond the narrow confines of self-consciousness. But what exactly did Descartes mean by clarity and distinctness? These terms, which might seem like mere metaphors, actually represent sophisticated epistemological concepts with precise technical meanings. A clear idea is one that is present and accessible to the attentive mind, like a clearly visible object in bright light as opposed to something dim or obscure. Clarity is fundamentally about the presence of an idea to consciousness and the absence of any vagueness or confusion in apprehending it. You clearly perceive your own pain, for example, because pain presents itself directly to consciousness without mediation or interpretation. Distinctness is a more demanding requirement that builds upon clarity. A distinct idea is not only clear in itself, but also sharply separated from all other ideas containing nothing that belongs to other ideas. Consider the difference between clearly perceiving that you are in pain and distinctly understanding the mathematical truth that triangles have three sides. Both ideas may be clear, but only the mathematical idea is also distinct because it involves no confusion with other concepts. Your perception of pain, while clear, may involve confused ideas about its physical causes or moral significance. Distinctness requires what contemporary philosophers call conceptual purity, the complete absence of irrelevant or confused elements. Descartes believed that clear and distinct ideas carried with them a kind of built-in evidence of their own truth. When you clearly and distinctly perceive a mathematical relationship like the Pythagorean theorem, you do not need external confirmation to know that it is true. The truth is evident in the very act of understanding the relationship between the concepts involved. This suggests that the human mind has a natural capacity to recognize truth when it encounters it in its pure form. Clear and distinct ideas are self-authenticating in a way that makes them immune to the skeptical doubts that undermine empirical knowledge. However, This raises a crucial problem that nearly destroyed Descartes' entire philosophical system. How can we trust our natural inclination to believe clear and distinct ideas if the evil demon hypothesis is still on the table? The demon could be manipulating our minds so that false ideas appear clear and distinct, while true ideas appear confused and doubtful. What seems like rational insight could actually be systematic deception designed to lead us away from truth. This means that the criterion of clarity and distinctness cannot be trusted unless we first establish that no evil demon exists to deceive us about the relationship between clarity and truth. This logical problem forced Descartes into what critics call the Cartesian circle. In order to trust clear and distinct ideas, he needed to prove that God exists and is not a deceiver. But his proofs for God's existence relied on the principle that clear and distinct ideas are true. The argument seemed circular. He needed clear and distinct ideas to prove God's existence, but he needed God's existence to justify trusting clear and distinct ideas. This circularity threatened to undermine the entire Cartesian system of knowledge. Descartes' response to this problem revealed the sophisticated logical structure underlying his epistemology. He argued that the cogito and certain other fundamental truths are so basic that even an evil demon could not shake our conviction in them while we are actively considering them. These truths have what he called natural certainty, a kind of irresistible evidence that makes doubt psychologically impossible. Using these naturally certain truths as premises, he could prove God's existence without relying on the general principle that clear and distinct ideas are true. Once God's existence and benevolence are established, the general reliability of clear and distinct perception follows as a consequence. The doctrine of clear and distinct ideas also provided Descartes with a method for analyzing complex concepts into their simple components. Many of our ordinary ideas are confused mixtures of clear and confused elements. The idea of the sun, for example, combines clear mathematical concepts of size and distance with confused sensory impressions of warmth and brightness. By carefully separating the clear and distinct elements from the confused ones, we can purify our concepts and discover the true structure of reality. This analytical method became fundamental to modern scientific thinking and mathematical reasoning. Furthermore, the criterion of clarity and distinctness provided a foundation for Descartes' ambitious project of creating a universal science. If the same criterion that guarantees mathematical truth can be extended to physics, biology, psychology, and ethics, then all human knowledge could be unified under a single method. The boundaries between different sciences would become merely practical divisions rather than fundamental differences in subject matter or method. Everything that can be known clearly and distinctly could be organized into a single systematic science with the same degree of certainty as mathematics. However, applying the criterion of clarity and distinctness to empirical knowledge created new problems that Descartes did not fully anticipate. While mathematical ideas like triangularity and number seem to admit of clear and distinct perception, ideas derived from sensory experience are much more problematic. When you look at a physical object, how do you separate the clear and distinct ideas that represent its true nature from the confused sensory ideas that represent merely its appearance to you? This problem would force later philosophers to develop more sophisticated theories about the relationship between rational and empirical knowledge. The criterion that seemed so promising for mathematics proved much more difficult to apply to our knowledge of the physical world. Nevertheless, the doctrine of clear and distinct ideas established principles that continue to influence how we think about knowledge, evidence, and rational justification. The idea that truth carries its own evidence, that rational insight is self-authenticating, and that conceptual clarity is a mark of genuine understanding all trace back to Descartes' epistemology. Even philosophers who reject his specific criterion often accept his general approach of seeking internal rather than external criteria for distinguishing knowledge from mere belief. The doctrine represents one of the most systematic attempts in the history of thought to ground human knowledge in the structure of rational consciousness itself. Part 5. The Proofs for God's Existence. Descartes. Proofs for God's existence represent far more than mere theological exercises or attempts to avoid religious persecution. They are integral to his entire philosophical system, serving as the logical bridge between the certainty of self-consciousness and the possibility of objective knowledge about the external world. Understanding these proofs requires grasping both their internal logic and their systematic function within Cartesian epistemology, as well as the profound metaphysical assumptions about the nature of existence, perfection, and causation that underlie them. The first proof, known as the causal argument, begins with Descartes' analysis of his own idea of God. When he introspects carefully, he discovers that he possesses an idea of God as a supremely perfect being, infinite in power, knowledge, and goodness. This discovery raises a philosophical puzzle. Where could this idea have come from? Descartes argued that ideas must have adequate causes, and that the cause of an idea must contain at least as much reality as the idea represents. This principle, known as the causal adequacy principle, reflects a deep metaphysical assumption about the conservation of reality or perfection across causal relationships. The logic of the argument unfolds with mathematical precision. Descartes knows himself to be a finite, imperfect, doubting being. As such, he cannot be the cause of his idea of infinite perfection any more than a photograph can contain more detail than the camera that produced it. The idea of God contains infinitely more objective reality than Descartes possesses as a finite substance. Therefore, this idea must have been caused by something that actually possesses infinite perfection. Only God himself could be the adequate cause of the idea of God. But this argument rests on sophisticated assumptions about the nature of ideas and their relationship to reality. Descartes distinguished between the formal reality of an idea, which consists in its existence as a mental state, and its objective reality, which consists in the degree of perfection it represents. All ideas have the same formal reality because they are all equally mental states, but they differ dramatically in objective reality depending on what they represent. The idea of God has infinite objective reality because it represents infinite perfection, while the idea of a stone has minimal objective reality because it represents a very imperfect, finite substance. This distinction allows Descartes to argue that the cause of an idea must be assessed in terms of the idea objective reality rather than its formal reality. While any finite mind can produce ideas with the same formal reality, only an infinitely perfect cause can produce an idea with infinite objective reality. The causal argument thus moves from the content of consciousness to conclusions about the structure of reality itself. What we can think about places constraints on what must exist to make such thinking possible. Critics have challenged this argument at multiple levels. Why should we accept the causal adequacy principle in the first place? Even if we accept the principle for physical causation, why should it apply to the relationship between reality and the content of ideas? Furthermore, how do we know that we actually have a genuine idea of infinite perfection rather than merely a confused collection of vague concepts? These objections reveal deep questions about the relationship between thought and reality that continue to challenge philosophers today. Descartes' second proof, the ontological argument, takes a radically different approach that attempts to derive God existence purely from analysis of the concept of God. This argument has a long history in medieval philosophy, but Descartes gave it a distinctly modern formulation that emphasizes the mathematical character of the reasoning involved. Just as mathematical truths follow necessarily from the analysis of mathematical concepts, the existence of God follows necessarily from proper analysis of the concept of a supremely perfect being. The argument begins with the observation that we can clearly and distinctly conceive of God as containing all perfections. Existence, Descartes argued, is clearly a perfection, because existing things are greater than non-existing things with the same properties. A real mountain of gold is greater than an imaginary mountain of gold, and an actually omniscient being is greater than a merely possible omniscient being. Therefore, a supremely perfect being must possess existence among its perfections. To think of God as non-existent would be like thinking of a triangle as having four sides or a mountain as having no elevation. It involves a conceptual contradiction that clear thinking cannot sustain. The elegance of this argument lies in its claim to establish existence as a logical consequence of essence. While the existence of finite things is contingent and must be established through empirical investigation, the existence of an infinitely perfect being follows analytically from what it means to be infinitely perfect. God existence is not a factual discovery, but a logical truth, comparable to mathematical theorems. This gives divine existence a kind of necessity that no empirical truth can possess. However, this argument has been subjected to devastating criticisms from Descartes' time to the present. The most famous objection, later developed by Kant, argues that existence is not a property or perfection, but rather the precondition for having any properties at all. When you say that something exists, you are not attributing an additional property to it, but rather asserting that it has properties in the first place. Therefore, existence cannot be built into the definition of God any more than it can be built into the definition of anything else. The ontological argument confuses the logical structure of concepts with claims about what actually exists in reality. Furthermore, critics have questioned whether we actually have a clear and distinct idea of infinite perfection. Our concepts of perfection seem to be derived from finite examples of excellence that we then extrapolate beyond all limits. But this process of extrapolation might produce only a confused idea that contains internal contradictions, rather than a genuinely coherent concept. If our idea of God is actually confused rather than clear and distinct, then the ontological argument loses its foundation. Despite these criticisms, both proofs served crucial functions in Descartes' overall system. By establishing God existence and benevolence, they provided the guarantee that clear and distinct ideas correspond to reality. God would not allow humans to be systematically deceived about what they perceive most clearly and distinctly, because such deception would be inconsistent with divine perfection. This divine guarantee makes possible the transition from subjective certainty about mental contents to objective knowledge about the structure of reality. Without God, the evil demon hypothesis would remain a permanent threat to all knowledge claims beyond the cogito. The proofs also established metaphysical principles that would become central to modern philosophy and science. The causal adequacy principle underlying the first proof became a foundation for scientific reasoning about causes and effects. The ontological argument analysis of existence and essence influenced centuries of debate about the relationship between logic and reality. Even philosophers who reject Descartes' specific conclusions often accept the legitimacy of the questions he was asking about the rational foundations of belief in God. The proofs represent sophisticated attempts to show that theistic belief can be grounded in reason rather than mere faith or tradition. Moreover, the proofs reveal Descartes' conviction that philosophical reason can achieve results as certain as mathematical demonstration. If geometric theorems can be proven with absolute certainty, then metaphysical truths about the ultimate structure of reality should be equally demonstrable to careful rational analysis. This optimism about the power of human reason to penetrate the deepest secrets of existence would profoundly influence the development of modern philosophy and contribute to what historians call the Age of Reason. Whether this optimism was justified remains one of the central questions in evaluating the Cartesian legacy. Part 6. Mind-Body Dualism and the Interaction Problem. Descartes' substance dualism created what many consider the most profound and persistent problem in the philosophy of mind. If mental and physical substances are completely different in their essential natures, how can they interact in the intimate way that human experience seems to require? This interaction problem reveals deep tensions within the Cartesian system and raises fundamental questions about the nature of causation, the unity of human persons, and the possibility of a scientific understanding of consciousness. The problem arises directly from the logic of Cartesian metaphysics. Mental substance is defined by consciousness and is completely non-spatial, having no location, size, shape, or physical properties whatsoever. Physical substance is defined by spatial extension and is completely non-conscious, operating according to purely mechanical principles without any inner experience or awareness. These two kinds of substance are not just different, but logically opposite in their fundamental characteristics. Yet human experience seems to involve constant interaction between mental and physical events in ways that suggest intimate causal connections. Consider the apparent causal efficacy of consciousness in voluntary action. When you decide to raise your hand, your conscious intention seems to cause neural events in your brain, which in turn cause muscular contractions that result in the physical movement of your hand. This causal chain appears to begin with an immaterial mental event and culminate in material physical events. But how can something with no physical properties whatsoever exert causal influence on the physical world? What could it mean for a non-spatial mind to push or pull on spatial neurons? The very concept of causal interaction seems to presuppose some form of physical contact or energy transfer. The problem becomes even more acute when we consider causation in the opposite direction from body to mind. When you suffer a physical injury, the tissue damage causes pain sensations in your consciousness. When you ingest alcohol or caffeine, chemical changes in your brain affect your mental states, mood, and cognitive performance. These examples suggest that physical events can cause mental events. But how can spatial mechanical processes give rise to non-spatial conscious experiences? What could it mean for moving particles to create subjective sensations that have no physical properties at all? Descartes was acutely aware of this problem and attempted to solve it through his theory of psychophysical interaction via the pineal gland. He chose this small, unpaired gland at the centre of the brain because it seemed to be the only brain structure that was not bilaterally duplicated. Since the soul is a simple, indivisible substance, it would need to interact with the body at a single point, rather than being distributed across multiple locations. Descartes theorized that the mind could influence the movement of animal spirits, which were conceived as very fine material particles flowing through the nervous system. By affecting the flow of these spirits at the pineal gland, the immaterial mind could control bodily movements and responses. However, this proposed solution actually highlighted the depth of the interaction problem rather than solving it. Even if we grant that the pineal gland is the location where mind-body interaction occurs, we still need to explain the mechanism by which this interaction takes place. How does an immaterial substance move material particles, even very fine ones? If the mind has no physical properties, how can it exert forces, transfer energy, or influence the motion of anything physical? Descartes seemed to have merely localized the mystery rather than explaining it away. Critics pointed out that Descartes' theory violated his own principles of mechanical philosophy. Throughout his physics, he insisted that all physical events must be explained in terms of the size, shape, and motion of material particles interacting according to mathematical laws. No mysterious forces, spiritual influences, or non-mechanical causes were permitted in his scientific system. Yet, his theory of mind-body interaction seemed to require exactly the kind of non-mechanical causation that he had banished from the rest of nature. The mind became a ghostly exception to the otherwise universal reign of mechanical law. This tension led some of Descartes' followers to develop alternative theories that avoided the interaction problem by denying genuine causal interaction between mind and body. Occasionalism, developed by philosophers like Malebranche, argued that mind and body do not actually interact, but only appear to do so because God intervenes on every occasion to coordinate mental and physical events. When you will to raise your hand, God causes the appropriate brain states and muscle contractions to occur simultaneously with your willing. Parallelism, defended by philosophers like Leibniz, suggested that mind and body are like synchronized clocks that appear to influence each other but actually run independently according to their own internal principles. These alternative theories solved the interaction problem, but at the cost of making consciousness causally impotent. If minds do not really cause bodily actions, then what becomes of moral responsibility, free will, and the sense of personal agency that seems central to human experience? If physical events have purely physical causes, then consciousness becomes merely a passive observer of a mechanical process that would unfold in exactly the same way whether consciousness existed or not. This threatens to reduce the mind to what philosophers now call an epiphenomenon, a causally irrelevant byproduct of brain activity. The interaction problem also raised fundamental questions about the unity of human persons. If mind and body are completely different substances, what makes them parts of a single person, rather than two distinct beings that happen to be temporarily associated? Descartes sometimes described the relationship in terms of a pilot in a ship, but this analogy suggests a much looser connection than human experience actually involves. You do not feel like a non-physical pilot operating a physical vehicle. Rather, you experience yourself as a unified being whose mental and physical aspects are intimately integrated in ways that resist clear separation. Pain is not just a mental state caused by physical damage, but seems to be located in the body itself. Furthermore, the interaction problem highlighted deep questions about the nature of causation itself. Cartesian physics understood causation in terms of mechanical contact between material particles, but conscious causation seemed to require a fundamentally different kind of causal power. This suggested that there might be multiple types of causation operating in the universe, or alternatively, that our common sense understanding of mental causation is systematically mistaken. Either possibility raised profound questions about the unity of scientific explanation and the possibility of a complete physical theory of nature. The problem became even more complex when empirical discoveries revealed the intimate dependence of mental life on brain states. Brain injuries affect personality, memory, and cognitive abilities in ways that suggest much closer connections between mind and brain than Descartes' theory would predict. Drugs and diseases that affect brain chemistry have systematic effects on consciousness that seem difficult to reconcile with the independence of mental substance. These discoveries suggested that consciousness might be much more dependent on physical processes than substance dualism allows. Yet the qualitative, subjective nature of conscious experience still seems to resist reduction to purely physical terms. Contemporary philosophy of mind continues to grapple with updated versions of the interaction problem. How does consciousness emerge from neural activity? Can mental states have genuine causal powers in a world governed by physical laws? What is the relationship between subjective experience and objective brain processes? These questions trace back directly to the tensions that Descartes created by his rigorous separation of mental and physical substances. While few contemporary philosophers accept substance dualism in its original form, the problems it highlighted continue to challenge our understanding of the place of consciousness in the natural world. Part 7. The Wax Argument and Intellectual Intuition. Descartes. Famous wax argument represents one of the most ingenious thought experiments in the history of philosophy, designed to demonstrate that genuine knowledge of physical objects comes through intellectual understanding, rather than sensory experience. But the argument reveals much more than its surface conclusion about the primacy of reason over sensation. It provides insight into Descartes' theory of concepts, his understanding of the relationship between appearance and reality, and his conviction that mathematical reasoning can penetrate to the essential structure of the physical world. The argument begins with careful phenomenological observation of a piece of fresh beeswax. Descartes invites us to notice all the sensory qualities that we initially identify with the wax. Its particular colour, perhaps a golden yellow from the honeycomb. Its distinctive shape, likely hexagonal. Its sweet fragrance reminiscent of flowers and honey. Its hard texture when tapped. The clear sound it makes when struck. And its smooth, cool feel when handled. These sensory qualities seem to constitute what we mean by this particular piece of wax. They are immediately present to consciousness through the senses and require no intellectual analysis to apprehend. But then Descartes introduces the crucial experimental manipulation. He brings the wax near a fire and observes the systematic transformation of every single sensory property that initially characterized it. The golden colour disappears, replaced by transparency or perhaps a different hue entirely. The regular hexagonal shape melts into an irregular liquid form. The sweet fragrance dissipates, replaced by different odours or no smell at all. The hard texture becomes soft and yielding. The clear tapping sound is replaced by silence or the soft splash of liquid. The smooth, cool surface becomes warm and sticky. The philosophical puzzle that emerges is profound. If every sensory property that initially defined the wax has been completely transformed, In what sense is this still the same piece of wax? Common sense insists that it is indeed the same wax, merely changed in form. But this judgment cannot be based on sensory evidence, since all the sensory evidence has been contradicted. Something in our understanding of the wax transcends its particular sensory manifestations and recognizes a continuity that pure sensation cannot detect. Descartes argues that this continuity is grasped by the intellect rather than the senses. What remains constant through the transformation is not any particular sensory quality, but rather the wax capacity to take on various sensory qualities while remaining the same underlying substance. The intellect understands the wax as something extended in space that can assume indefinitely many different shapes, sizes, and textures. This understanding is not derived from sensory experience, but rather provides the conceptual framework that makes sensory experience of physical objects possible in the first place. The argument reveals Descartes' conviction that sensory experience is inherently limited and potentially misleading. The senses only show us how things appear under particular circumstances to particular observers. They cannot penetrate to the essential nature of things because they are always conditioned by the specific relationship between the observer and the observed. The wax appears yellow under certain lighting conditions, but its apparent colour depends as much on the light source and the observer visual system as on any intrinsic properties of the wax itself. Sensory qualities are relational rather than absolute, telling us more about our interaction with objects than about the objects themselves. By contrast, intellectual understanding grasps essential rather than accidental properties. When the intellect understands the wax as extended substance capable of taking various shapes, it is not describing how the wax appears, but rather what it fundamentally is. Extension and the capacity for shape change are not conditional on particular circumstances, but belong to the essence of physical substance as such. This intellectual insight is not derived from comparing different sensory experiences, but from analyzing the logical conditions that must be satisfied for any sensory experience of physical objects to be possible. The wax argument also demonstrates Descartes' method of rational analysis. Instead of passively accepting the deliverances of common sense or sensory experience, he actively interrogates our concepts to discover their logical structure. The question is not just what we happen to believe about the wax, but what we must believe for our concept of physical substance to be coherent. This analytical approach treats concepts as mathematical objects that can be studied through rational reflection rather than empirical investigation. Just as geometric analysis reveals the essential properties of triangles by examining the concept of triangularity, metaphysical analysis reveals the essential properties of physical objects by examining the concept of material substance. However, the argument raises deep questions about the relationship between intellectual understanding and empirical knowledge. If the intellect can grasp the essential nature of physical objects through pure analysis, what role remains for empirical science? Descartes seemed to believe that rational analysis could determine not just the general framework within which physical objects must be understood, but also specific truths about their behaviour and properties. This suggested that physics could be developed as a branch of mathematics, deriving the laws of nature from clear and distinct ideas about the essence of matter. Critics have questioned whether Descartes' argument actually establishes what he claimed. The fact that we continue to identify the melted substance as wax might reflect linguistic convention or practical interest rather than intellectual insight into essential properties. We call it the same wax because we are tracing a causal continuity, or because we are interested in the same material stuff, regardless of its changing properties. This does not necessarily show that the intellect grasps some metaphysical essence that transcends sensory appearance. The argument might reveal more about how concepts function in ordinary language than about the ultimate nature of material reality. Furthermore, the argument assumes a sharp distinction between intellectual and sensory knowledge that contemporary cognitive science has called into question. Our recognition that the melted substance is still wax might involve complex interactions between sensory processing, memory, conceptual knowledge, and practical concerns. The intellect does not operate independently of the senses, but rather integrates sensory information in sophisticated ways that reflect both learned concepts and innate cognitive structures. The unity of perceptual experience might not require transcendent intellectual intuition, but could emerge from the complex information processing capabilities of embodied minds. Nevertheless, the wax argument identified genuine puzzles about the nature of objectivity and the relationship between appearance and reality. Physical objects do seem to have properties that transcend their particular appearances to particular observers. Scientific understanding does seem to penetrate beyond the surface phenomena that are immediately given in experience. The question is whether this transcendence requires immaterial intellectual intuition or can be explained in terms of more complex empirical processes. Descartes' argument continues to challenge philosophers and cognitive scientists to explain how minds can achieve objective knowledge of a world that is never given directly in experience. Part 8. Innate Ideas and the Structure of Mind. Descartes' theory of innate ideas represents one of his most influential contributions to psychology and epistemology, proposing that the human mind comes equipped with fundamental concepts and principles that are not derived from experience, but are built into the very structure of rational consciousness. This theory challenged the dominant empiricist assumption that all knowledge comes from sensory experience and suggested instead that the capacity for knowledge depends on innate mental structures that shape and organize experience from the very beginning of mental life. The theory emerged from Descartes' analysis of mathematical knowledge and its peculiar certainty. When you understand that triangles necessarily have three sides, or that 2 plus 3 equals 5, this knowledge seems to possess a necessity and universality that cannot be explained by empirical observation alone. You do not learn these truths by examining many triangles or by counting objects repeatedly until you notice a pattern. Rather, you seem to recognize them as necessarily true as soon as you understand the concepts involved. This suggests that the concepts themselves, along with the logical principles that govern their relationships, are not abstracted from experience, but are presupposed by any meaningful experience of mathematical objects. Descartes extended this analysis beyond mathematics to include fundamental metaphysical concepts like substance, causation, existence, and perfection. When you think about causes and effects, you do not simply observe temporal sequences, but apply a principle that every event must have an adequate cause. This principle cannot itself be derived from experience because it is presupposed by any causal reasoning about experience. Similarly, when you think about existence, you are not simply cataloguing objects in the world, but applying a concept that distinguishes between what is real and what is merely imaginary or possible. These fundamental concepts provide the logical framework within which all empirical knowledge becomes possible. Most remarkably, Descartes argued that the idea of God as infinitely perfect substance is also innate to human minds. This claim was not merely theological, but played a crucial role in his epistemological system. If humans naturally possess the concept of infinite perfection, this provides evidence that they are created by an infinitely perfect being who would not systematically deceive them about what they clearly and distinctly perceive. The innate idea of God thus serves as the foundation for trusting human reason and for believing that clear and distinct ideas correspond to reality. Without this innate connection to divine perfection, human reason would remain trapped within the circle of its own possibly deceptive ideas. But what exactly did Descartes mean by claiming that ideas are innate? He was careful to distinguish between different senses in which ideas might be considered innate to avoid common misunderstandings. Innate ideas are not necessarily present to consciousness from birth, like vivid images or explicit beliefs. Rather, they are dispositions or capacities that unfold under appropriate circumstances when the mind encounters relevant experiences. Think of innate ideas as being like the genetic program that guides biological development. Not present as fully formed structures from the beginning, but as potentials that actualize themselves through interaction with the environment. This developmental understanding of innateness helped Descartes respond to empiricist objections. Critics pointed out that children and people from different cultures often seemed to lack the supposedly innate ideas that Descartes claimed were universal features of human nature. If mathematical concepts are truly innate, why do children have such difficulty learning mathematics? If the idea of God is built into human minds, why do some cultures develop very different religious concepts or even atheistic worldviews? Descartes' response was that innate ideas require proper development through education, reflection and favourable circumstances to manifest themselves clearly. Their innateness consists in the capacity for acquiring them, rather than in their immediate presence to consciousness. The theory of innate ideas also addressed fundamental questions about the relationship between mind and world. How can finite human minds achieve knowledge of mathematical truths that seem to be universal and eternal? How can conscious thoughts be about anything beyond themselves? Descartes' answer was that innate ideas provide the conceptual bridge between subjective consciousness and objective reality. Because innate ideas are implanted in human minds by the same God who creates and sustains the external world, they serve as reliable guides to the structure of reality itself. Mathematical ideas correspond to mathematical structures in nature because both mind and world are products of the same divine creativity. This theory had profound implications for understanding human nature and the goals of education. If the most important concepts and principles are innate, then learning is fundamentally a process of discovery rather than accumulation. Good teaching does not involve pouring information into passive minds, but rather awakening the innate capacities that students already possess. This view influenced pedagogical theories for centuries and continues to shape debates about whether education should focus on transmitting cultural knowledge or developing natural capacities. Descartes' theory also provided a framework for understanding individual differences in intellectual ability. While all humans possess the same basic innate ideas, they differ in their capacity to develop and apply these ideas effectively. Some people have more natural talent for mathematics, others for metaphysical reasoning, still others for practical affairs. But these differences reflect variations in how innate capacities unfold, rather than fundamental differences in human nature. With proper method and sufficient effort, Descartes believed, any person could achieve clear and distinct knowledge in any domain. This optimistic assessment of human intellectual potential became one of the defining characteristics of Enlightenment thought. However, the theory of innate ideas faced serious philosophical and empirical challenges. Empiricist philosophers like Locke argued that there is no need to postulate innate ideas if all knowledge can be explained through the processing of sensory information by general learning mechanisms. Why multiply theoretical entities by assuming innate ideas when simpler explanations are available? Furthermore, if innate ideas require development through experience, how can we distinguish them from ideas that are simply learned through experience? The theory seemed to risk becoming empirically untestable by making innateness compatible with any pattern of mental development. Modern cognitive science has revived interest in nativist theories while transforming their empirical content. Research in developmental psychology suggests that infants possess innate expectations about physical objects, number, and social relationships that guide learning from very early ages. Studies of language acquisition indicate that children master grammatical structures far more rapidly than would be possible if they were learning purely from environmental input. Neuroscience reveals that the brain has specialized systems for processing different types of information, suggesting that cognitive architecture reflects innate design principles. These findings support some form of nativism, while showing that the specific content of innate ideas is more limited and domain-specific than Descartes envisioned. Nevertheless, Descartes' fundamental insight about the active, structured nature of mind continues to influence contemporary theories of cognition. Even philosophers who reject innate ideas often accept that minds impose organizational principles on experience rather than passively receiving environmental input. The question is not whether minds are active, but rather how much of their activity reflects innate structure versus learned skills. Descartes' theory established that this question is central to understanding both the nature of knowledge and the distinctive capacities of human intelligence. Part 9. The Method and Rules for Direction of the Mind. Descartes believed that most intellectual errors result not from lack of native intelligence, but from failure to follow proper method in the pursuit of truth. His rules for the direction of the mind and the method outlined in the Discourse on Method represent systematic attempts to codify the procedures that any rational person can follow to achieve reliable knowledge in any domain. But understanding these methodological proposals requires grasping both their mathematical inspiration and their ambitious scope, as Descartes hoped to create a universal science that could solve all soluble human problems through systematic reasoning. The method emerged from Descartes' reflection on why mathematics achieves such remarkable certainty, while other disciplines remain mired in controversy and confusion. Mathematical reasoning proceeds through clear definitions, systematic deduction, and careful attention to each step in complex arguments. Mathematicians do not rely on authority, tradition, or probable conjecture, but build their conclusions on foundations that admit no reasonable doubt. They resolve complex problems by breaking them into simple components that can be understood individually, and then combining these simple insights to achieve understanding of the whole. Most importantly, they never accept anything as true unless they can see clearly and distinctly why it must be true. Descartes believed that this mathematical approach could be extended beyond mathematics to create what he called mathesis universalis, or universal mathematics. All domains of human knowledge, from physics and biology to ethics and politics, could be organized according to the same systematic principles that govern mathematical reasoning. The key insight was that successful reasoning depends more on following proper method than on dealing with any particular subject matter. The same mental operations that allow us to solve geometric problems or algebraic equations can be applied to questions about the nature of material substance, the existence of God, or the foundations of moral obligation. The method consists of 4 fundamental rules that Descartes presented as universally applicable procedures for discovering truth. The first rule requires never accepting anything as true unless you recognize it clearly and distinctly to be such. This means avoiding prejudice, hasty judgment, and acceptance of beliefs on inadequate grounds. You must develop the intellectual virtue of systematic doubt, questioning every assumption until you reach ideas that carry their own evidence of truth. This rule transforms skepticism from a destructive force into a constructive tool for separating genuine knowledge from mere opinion. The second rule requires dividing each complex problem into as many simple parts as possible. Complex issues become manageable when they are broken down into components that can be understood individually. Just as a complex geometric proof is built from simple axioms and definitions, complex philosophical or scientific problems can be resolved by analyzing their basic elements. This analytical approach assumes that wholes can be understood through understanding their parts, and that complexity emerges from the combination of simple elements according to discoverable principles. The third rule establishes the proper order for conducting investigations. Begin with the simplest and most easily known objects, and ascend gradually to knowledge of the more complex. This rule reflects Descartes' conviction that knowledge has a logical structure that mirrors the structure of reality itself. Just as geometric theorems must be proven in a specific order that respects their logical dependencies, all genuine knowledge must be organized according to relationships of logical priority. You cannot understand complex phenomena until you understand the simple elements from which they are composed. This methodological requirement led Descartes to seek absolutely simple starting points that could serve as foundations for entire domains of knowledge. The fourth rule requires making enumeration so complete and reviews so general that you are assured of omitting nothing relevant. Even the most careful analysis is worthless if it overlooks crucial considerations or fails to consider all the relevant evidence. Systematic enumeration guards against the natural tendency to focus on considerations that support conclusions we want to reach while ignoring contrary evidence. Complete review ensures that complex arguments remain coherent and that each step follows validly from previous steps. This rule emphasizes the importance of intellectual honesty and methodical thoroughness in the pursuit of truth. These 4 rules were designed to transform the natural operations of human reason into systematic procedures that could be taught, learned, and applied reliably. Descartes believed that most people possess adequate natural intelligence for discovering truth but lack training in proper method. Just as natural athletic ability must be developed through systematic practice to achieve excellence in sports, natural rational capacity must be developed through methodical training to achieve excellence in reasoning. The rules provide this training by making explicit the procedures that successful thinkers follow intuitively. The method also reflected Descartes' conviction that individual reason is more reliable than collective authority in matters of fundamental importance. Traditional approaches to knowledge relied on mastering the opinions of ancient authorities and reconciling conflicts between different schools of thought. Descartes proposed instead that each individual should start from scratch, using methodical doubt to clear away inherited prejudices and then rebuilding knowledge according to what their own reason could discover. This individualistic approach to knowledge reflected broader cultural changes associated with the Protestant Reformation and the rise of modern science. Truth was to be discovered rather than received, and discovered by individuals using their own rational capacities rather than by communities preserving traditional wisdom. However, Descartes' method faced significant challenges when applied beyond the mathematical domains where it seemed most natural. The demand for clear and distinct ideas worked well for geometry and algebra, but proved more problematic for empirical sciences that must deal with the messy complexities of sensory observation. How do you achieve clear and distinct knowledge of biological processes, chemical reactions, or astronomical phenomena? These domains involve contingent facts that must be discovered through observation rather than necessary truths that can be deduced from definitions. The method seemed to presuppose that all genuine knowledge has the same logical structure as mathematics, an assumption that later philosophers would challenge. Furthermore, the method assumption that complex wholes can always be understood through analysis of simple parts proved inadequate for many domains of inquiry. Living organisms, social institutions, and conscious experiences might involve emergent properties that cannot be reduced to the properties of their constituent elements. Some wholes might be genuinely more than the sum of their parts, requiring holistic rather than analytic approaches to understanding. The mechanical philosophy that Descartes derived from his method might systematically miss aspects of reality that resist mathematical treatment. Nevertheless, Descartes' methodological innovations profoundly influenced the development of modern science and philosophy. The emphasis on systematic doubt, careful analysis, and step-by-step reasoning became standard features of rigorous inquiry in all domains. The ideal of reducing complex problems to simple components that could be studied individually became central to scientific methodology. Even researchers who reject Descartes' specific rules often accept his general conviction that proper method is crucial for achieving reliable knowledge. The rules for the direction of the mind established methodological self-consciousness as a defining characteristic of modern intellectual culture. Part 10. The Mechanical Philosophy and the New Science. Descartes' revolutionary approach to understanding the natural world fundamentally transformed how humanity conceptualized the relationship between mind, matter, and scientific explanation. His mechanical philosophy represented a radical departure from medieval and Renaissance approaches that saw nature as filled with purposes, spiritual forces, and hidden qualities. Instead, Descartes proposed that the entire physical universe, from the smallest particles to the largest celestial bodies, operates according to purely mathematical principles that govern the motion of matter in space. The foundation of this mechanical worldview rested on Descartes' analysis of material substance as essentially nothing more than extension in 3 dimensions. Physical objects have no properties beyond their geometrical characteristics: size, shape, position, and motion. All the qualities that seem to make the natural world rich and varied colours, sounds, tastes, odours, warmth and cold are not actually properties of material things themselves, but rather effects that material motions produce in conscious observers. A red rose is not actually red, but consists of particles with specific sizes and motions that, when they interact with human visual systems, produce the subjective experience of redness. The rose's apparent colour, fragrance and texture are projections of consciousness onto what is fundamentally just matter in motion. This mechanistic analysis had staggering implications for scientific methodology. If nature consists entirely of matter in motion, then all natural phenomena must be explicable through mathematical principles governing spatial relationships and temporal changes. There could be no appeals to mysterious forces, vital principles, or teleological explanations based on purposes or goals. Every natural event must be caused by previous natural events according to laws that can be expressed in mathematical equations. This meant that scientific explanation should take the form of showing how complex phenomena result from the interaction of simple material components following universal mechanical principles. Descartes applied this mechanical approach to explaining a remarkable range of natural phenomena. He developed theories of planetary motion that preceded and influenced Newton's gravitational mechanics. He explained the formation of the solar system through vortical motions of cosmic matter, suggesting that celestial bodies were carried along by whirlpool, like currents in a subtle material medium. He analyzed the behavior of light through mechanical principles, proposing that light consists of pressure transmitted instantaneously through a material medium rather than particles traveling through space. He even attempted to explain magnetic and gravitational effects through the motion of imperceptible material particles rather than mysterious forces acting at a distance. Perhaps most remarkably, Descartes extended his mechanical analysis to living organisms, including the human body. He argued that animal bodies are essentially complex machines, operating according to the same mechanical principles that govern clockwork mechanisms or hydraulic systems. Digestion, circulation, respiration, sensation, and movement could all be explained through the mechanical interaction of bodily parts without invoking any spiritual or vital principles. Animals, lacking rational souls, are nothing more than elaborate automata that respond to stimuli according to mechanical programming. Even many aspects of human physiology operate mechanically, with the rational soul intervening only in distinctively human activities like language, reasoning, and moral choice. This mechanistic approach to biology led Descartes to make remarkable predictions about the possibility of artificial life and mechanical simulation of biological functions. If living bodies operate according to mechanical principles, then it should be possible, at least in principle, to construct artificial organisms that duplicate biological processes. Descartes suggested that sufficiently sophisticated automata could be built to imitate most animal behaviors so perfectly that they would be indistinguishable from real animals to casual observation. Only the rational capacities of humans, which depend on immaterial souls rather than mechanical processes, would be impossible to replicate artificially. These ideas anticipated modern developments in robotics, artificial intelligence and bioengineering by several centuries. The mechanical philosophy also revolutionized thinking about causation and natural law. Medieval science had relied heavily on Aristotelian concepts of formal and final causation, explaining natural events in terms of the essential natures of things and their inherent tendencies towards specific goals. Descartes' mechanical philosophy recognized only efficient causation, the direct transmission of motion from one material thing to another through contact. Natural laws became descriptions of universal patterns in the motion of matter rather than expressions of cosmic purposes or the essential natures of natural kinds. This shift from teleological to mechanical explanation became one of the defining characteristics of modern scientific thinking. However, Descartes' mechanical philosophy faced serious theoretical and empirical challenges. His commitment to explaining all physical interactions through direct contact made it difficult to account for phenomena that seemed to involve action at a distance. Gravitational attraction, magnetic forces, and electrostatic effects appeared to violate the principle that material things can only influence each other through mechanical contact. Descartes attempts to explain these phenomena through invisible material vortices and subtle matter became increasingly complex and speculative. Newton's later success in describing gravitational effects mathematically without explaining their mechanical causes showed that nature might not conform to Cartesian expectations about how physical causation must operate. The mechanical philosophy also struggled with the problem of explaining the origin of motion in a purely material universe. If matter is essentially inert and can only be moved by other matter, what is the ultimate source of all the motion we observe in nature? Descartes' solution was to invoke God as the primary cause, who initially imparted motion to matter and continues to conserve the total quantity of motion in the universe. But this solution seemed to conflict with his goal of providing purely mechanical explanations of natural phenomena. The need for divine intervention to explain the origin and conservation of motion suggested that mechanical principles alone might be insufficient for a complete understanding of nature. Furthermore, the mechanical philosophy created what many saw as an unbridgeable gap between the objective world described by science and the subjective world of human experience. If physical reality consists entirely of colourless, soundless, tasteless matter in motion, then all the qualitative richness of experienced reality becomes relegated to the realm of mental appearances. The rose that appears red and fragrant to consciousness exists only as a pattern of particle motions that somehow cause subjective experiences in minds. This created what philosophers call the problem of secondary qualities. How can purely quantitative mechanical processes give rise to qualitative conscious experiences? The mechanical philosophy seemed to make consciousness an inexplicable anomaly in an otherwise law-governed universe. Despite these challenges, Descartes' mechanical philosophy established principles that continue to influence scientific thinking today. The assumption that natural phenomena should be explained through mathematical laws governing the behavior of material systems became fundamental to modern physics, chemistry, and biology. The rejection of teleological explanation in favor of mechanical causation became standard scientific methodology. The goal of reducing complex phenomena to simpler components operating according to universal principles remains central to reductionist research programs across the sciences. Even scientists who work with non-mechanical concepts like fields, forces, and emergent properties often maintain Cartesian commitments to mathematical law and quantitative analysis. The mechanical philosophy also established the conceptual framework for ongoing debates about the relationship between scientific and humanistic ways of understanding reality. If science reveals that the world is fundamentally mechanical, what happens to human values, purposes, and meanings? Can moral and aesthetic judgments be grounded in objective reality, or do they belong entirely to the subjective realm of consciousness? These questions, first raised in acute form by Cartesian mechanism, continue to challenge philosophers, scientists, and humanists seeking to integrate scientific and humanistic perspectives on human life and cosmic significance. Part 11. The Passions of the Soul and Human Psychology. Descartes' final major work, The Passions of the Soul, represents his most systematic attempt to understand human psychology and the complex interactions between mental and physical aspects of human nature. This treatise reveals a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of mind-body relationships than is often associated with Cartesian dualism, showing how Descartes grappled seriously with the practical realities of embodied human experience. The work provides crucial insights into his theories of emotion, motivation, moral psychology, and the integration of rational and passionate dimensions of human life. Descartes defined passions as perceptions, feelings, or emotions of the soul that are caused, maintained, and strengthened by some movement of the spirits in the body. This definition immediately reveals the complex psychophysical nature of emotional experience. Passions are mental phenomena experienced by the immaterial soul, but they are causally dependent on physical processes involving what Descartes called animal spirits, very fine material particles that flow through the nervous system. This means that emotional life necessarily involves both mental and physical dimensions in ways that cannot be cleanly separated. Understanding human psychology requires analyzing both the subjective experience of emotions and the bodily mechanisms that produce and sustain them. The analysis of passions forced Descartes to develop a more sophisticated account of mind-body interaction than he had provided in his earlier works. Unlike voluntary actions, which seem to originate in mental decisions that then influence bodily behavior, passions seem to originate in bodily processes that then affect mental states. When you encounter a threatening situation, physiological changes like increased heart rate, muscle tension, and altered breathing patterns occur automatically and then give rise to the mental experience of fear. This suggests that the body has its own intelligence, responding to environmental challenges according to patterns that promote survival and well-being. The rational soul must learn to work with and regulate these automatic bodily responses, rather than simply commanding them from above. Descartes developed a systematic classification of the basic passions, arguing that all emotional experiences can be understood as combinations or variations of 6 primary emotions: wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. Wonder is the most fundamental passion, representing the soul's response to objects that appear novel or extraordinary. It involves neither attraction nor aversion, but simply focused attention that prepares the mind for learning about significant features of the environment. Love and hatred represent the soul's basic attitudes of attraction and repulsion toward objects that are judged beneficial or harmful. Desire is the active passion that motivates pursuit of goods and avoidance of evils. Joy and sadness reflect the soul's responses to the possession or loss of valued objects. This classification system allowed Descartes to analyze complex emotional states as combinations of these basic elements. Jealousy, for example, involves love for a particular person, hatred for rivals, desire to maintain exclusive possession, sadness at the threat of loss, and sometimes wonder at unexpected challenges to one's position. By breaking down complex emotions into simpler components, Descartes hoped to make emotional life more intelligible and therefore more amenable to rational management. Understanding the structure of passions is the first step toward achieving appropriate emotional responses and avoiding the psychological conflicts that arise from confused or excessive emotions. The treatise also revealed Descartes' sophisticated understanding of the adaptive functions that passions serve in human life. Emotions are not merely obstacles to rational thinking, but rather evolved mechanisms that promote survival and flourishing in complex social and physical environments. Fear motivates avoidance of genuine dangers. Love promotes attachment to beneficial relationships. Anger mobilizes resources for overcoming obstacles, and joy rewards successful achievement of goals. The problem is not that humans have emotions, but that emotional responses sometimes become inappropriate to current circumstances or excessive in intensity and duration. Rational management of emotions involves cultivating appropriate emotional responses rather than eliminating emotional responsiveness altogether. This led Descartes to develop what may be the first systematic theory of emotional regulation in the history of psychology. Since passions are caused by movements of animal spirits in the body, they cannot be directly controlled by acts of will in the way that voluntary actions can be controlled. You cannot simply decide to stop feeling angry or afraid any more than you can decide to stop feeling physically ill. However, passions can be influenced indirectly through changes in attention, judgment, imagination, and behavioral response. By focusing attention on different aspects of situations, by reconsidering judgments about what is beneficial or harmful, and by cultivating different patterns of response, people can gradually reshape their emotional patterns. Descartes emphasized the crucial role of early experience and habit formation in shaping emotional dispositions. The connections between bodily movements and mental experiences are established through repeated associations that become deeply ingrained neural patterns. Children who grow up in threatening environments may develop hypersensitive fear responses that persist even when they encounter safe situations as adults. Conversely, children who experience consistent love and security may develop emotional resilience that helps them cope with later challenges. This suggests that emotional education should begin early and focus on helping young people develop healthy emotional habits rather than merely teaching them to suppress inappropriate feelings. The analysis of passions also provided Descartes with resources for addressing classical philosophical questions about the relationship between reason and emotion. The Stoic tradition had generally viewed emotions as diseases of the soul that should be eliminated through rational discipline. The Aristotelian tradition had argued for moderation and the cultivation of appropriate emotional responses. Descartes' position was closer to Aristotle, but with important innovations based on his dualistic metaphysics and mechanical understanding of bodily processes. Reason and emotion are not opposed forces competing for control of human behavior, but rather complementary aspects of a unified human response to environmental challenges. However, Descartes' account of emotional regulation raised difficult questions about personal responsibility and moral development. If passions are caused by automatic bodily processes that individuals do not directly control, to what extent can people be held responsible for their emotional responses? If emotional patterns are established through early experiences and habitual associations, how much freedom do individuals have to reshape their psychological dispositions? Descartes seemed to believe that rational reflection and systematic practice could eventually overcome even deeply ingrained emotional patterns, but this optimistic assessment may underestimate the power of unconscious psychological forces. The treatise on passions also revealed tensions within Descartes' dualistic framework. The intimate connections between mental and physical aspects of emotional experience seemed to conflict with his earlier claims about the complete separation of mental and material substances. If the soul is truly immaterial and the body is purely mechanical, how can they interact so seamlessly in emotional responses? The analysis of passions suggested that mind and body might be much more integrated than substance dualism allows, pointing toward more holistic understandings of human nature. This tension would motivate later philosophers to develop alternative theories that could better account for the psychophysical unity of human experience. Nevertheless, Descartes' analysis of the passions established foundations for scientific psychology that continue to influence contemporary research. His emphasis on the biological functions of emotions, the role of early experience in shaping emotional dispositions, and the possibility of emotional regulation through cognitive and behavioral interventions all anticipate modern developments in effective neuroscience and clinical psychology. His systematic approach to classifying emotions and analyzing their causal relationships provided models for later scientific studies of emotional processes. Even researchers who reject his dualistic metaphysics often accept his methodological commitment to understanding emotions through careful analysis of their causes, functions, and regulation. Part 12. The problem of error and the freedom of the will. One of the most challenging problems facing Descartes' philosophical system was explaining how error and falsehood are possible if humans are created by a perfect, non-deceiving God and equipped with cognitive faculties designed to track truth. This problem forced Descartes to develop a sophisticated theory of judgment, free will, and intellectual responsibility that reveals deep insights into the nature of knowledge, belief, and moral agency. His solution involved distinguishing between different mental faculties and showing how error results from misusing these faculties rather than from any defect in their divine design. The problem arose directly from Descartes' arguments for God's existence and benevolence. If God is infinitely perfect, then God would not create beings with systematically defective cognitive abilities. If God is not a deceiver, then the natural tendency to believe clear and distinct ideas must generally lead to truth rather than error. But human beings obviously make mistakes, hold false beliefs, and disagree with each other about fundamental questions. How can widespread human error be reconciled with divine perfection and the reliability of human cognitive faculties? This question threatened to undermine either Descartes' arguments for God's existence or his confidence in the general reliability of human reason. Descartes' solution involved a careful analysis of the mental acts involved in forming judgments and beliefs. He argued that judgment involves the cooperation of two distinct mental faculties, the understanding, which perceives ideas and their relationships, and the will, which affirms or denies propositions based on what the understanding perceives. The understanding is purely passive, simply apprehending whatever ideas are presented to it without adding or subtracting anything. The will, by contrast, is active, making decisions about which propositions to accept as true and which to reject as false. Error occurs not through defects in either faculty considered separately, but through inappropriate coordination between understanding and will. According to Descartes' analysis, the understanding is actually infallible within its proper scope. When the understanding clearly and distinctly perceives the relationship between ideas, it cannot be mistaken about what it perceives. If you clearly understand that triangles have three sides, your understanding cannot be wrong about this relationship. The problem arises when the will makes judgments about matters that the understanding does not clearly and distinctly perceive. Most of our beliefs concern matters that are more or less probable rather than absolutely certain. and in these cases the will must decide how much evidence is sufficient for belief. Error results from hasty judgment, accepting propositions as true when the evidence is insufficient to guarantee their truth. This analysis revealed what Descartes considered to be a profound asymmetry between the scope of human understanding and the scope of human will. The understanding is finite, capable of clearly and distinctly perceiving only a limited range of ideas and relationships. Much of reality remains obscure, confused, or completely unknown to human minds. The will, however, is infinite in scope, capable of affirming or denying any proposition that the understanding can entertain, regardless of how clearly or distinctly the understanding perceives it. This mismatch between finite understanding and infinite will creates the conditions under which error becomes possible. Humans can choose to believe things that they do not clearly understand, and this choice is the ultimate source of all intellectual error. The theory had important implications for understanding intellectual virtue and the ethics of belief. If error results from misusing the will rather than from defects in understanding, then avoiding error becomes a matter of moral discipline rather than merely intellectual training. The fundamental intellectual virtue is learning to restrain the will so that it only affirms what the understanding clearly and distinctly perceives. This requires developing habits of intellectual humility, systematic doubt, and careful attention to the degrees of evidence supporting different beliefs. Intellectual responsibility involves recognizing the limits of one's understanding and proportioning belief to evidence rather than to desire, tradition, or social pressure. Descartes also used this analysis to address classical questions about the compatibility of human freedom with divine providence. If God creates and sustains all human mental acts, including acts of will, how can humans be genuinely free and responsible for their choices? Descartes argued that divine causation and human freedom operate at different levels and therefore do not conflict. God creates and sustains the capacity for willing, but the specific content of human choices is determined by human agents themselves. Divine providence ensures that humans have the power to choose, but it does not determine what they choose. This preserves genuine human responsibility, while acknowledging complete dependence on divine creative activity. The freedom of the will also played a crucial role in Descartes' understanding of human dignity and moral agency. The will is the aspect of human nature that most closely resembles divine nature, possessing a kind of infinity that transcends the limitations of finite understanding. When humans exercise their will responsibly, choosing to believe only what they clearly understand and to pursue only what they clearly recognize as good, they participate in the divine activity of rational choice. This makes humans uniquely valuable among created beings and explains why they bear special responsibilities for their beliefs and actions. The proper use of free will is what makes genuinely human life possible. However, this theory of error and freedom faced serious philosophical objections. Critics argued that Descartes had not really solved the problem of error, but merely relocated it. If the will naturally tends to affirm what appears true to the understanding, why does it sometimes choose to affirm propositions that are not clearly and distinctly perceived? What accounts for the will's tendency to overstep the bounds of clear understanding? Descartes seemed to assume that humans naturally know when their understanding is clear and distinct versus when it is confused or inadequate. But this assumption is questionable, since people often feel certain about beliefs that turn out to be false. Furthermore, the theory seemed to make knowledge dependent on moral virtue in ways that many found problematic. If avoiding error requires restraining the will to affirm only what is clearly and distinctly understood, then intellectual achievement becomes primarily a matter of moral discipline rather than cognitive ability. This suggests that disagreements about fundamental questions might reflect moral failings rather than honest intellectual differences. Critics worried that this approach could lead to intellectual arrogance and intolerance, with each person convinced that those who disagree must be morally deficient. The theory also raised difficult questions about the relationship between freedom and rational constraint. Descartes sometimes suggested that genuine freedom consists in choosing what reason clearly shows to be true or good. When the understanding clearly and distinctly perceives a truth, the will is naturally and appropriately determined to affirm it. But this seems to make freedom compatible with a kind of rational determinism that leaves little room for alternative choices. If true freedom consists in following reason, then disagreement with rational conclusions might indicate lack of freedom rather than exercise of freedom. This tension between autonomy and rationality would become central to later debates about the nature of free will and moral responsibility. Nevertheless, Descartes' analysis of error and freedom established important frameworks for thinking about intellectual responsibility, the ethics of belief, and the relationship between knowledge and moral character. His emphasis on the role of will in judgment highlighted the active, constructive nature of human cognition, rather than treating knowledge as passive reception of information. His insistence that error results from misusing our cognitive faculties, rather than from their inherent defects, provided a foundation for optimism about the possibility of human knowledge. Even philosophers who reject his specific solutions often accept his general approach of analyzing knowledge in terms of the proper coordination of different mental faculties. Part 13. The External World and Material Substance. Having established his own existence as a thinking substance and proven the existence of a benevolent God, Descartes faced the crucial task of demonstrating that material objects exist independently of consciousness and that human knowledge of the external world is possible. This problem was made particularly acute by his methodical doubt, which had called into question all beliefs based on sensory experience. His solution required showing how clear and distinct ideas about material substance could be distinguished from confused sensory ideas, and how the existence of an external world could be proven rather than merely assumed. Descartes began his analysis of material substance by examining what he could clearly and distinctly understand about physical objects, as opposed to what he confusedly imagined about them through sensory experience. When he carefully analyzed his idea of a material thing, he discovered that its essential nature consists entirely in extension in 3 dimensions. Physical objects are essentially spatial entities that can have various sizes, shapes and positions, and that can move from one location to another. All other qualities that we commonly attribute to material things, their colors, tastes, sounds, temperatures and textures, are not actually properties of the things themselves, but rather confused ideas that arise from the interaction between physical objects and conscious observers. This analysis had revolutionary implications for understanding the nature of scientific knowledge. If material substance consists essentially only in geometrical properties, then physics should be reducible to a branch of mathematics dealing with the motion of extended things through space and time. All genuine physical properties must be quantifiable and measurable because they must be reducible to relationships of size, shape, position and motion. Qualities that resist mathematical treatment, like the experienced redness of roses or the felt warmth of fire, belong to the realm of conscious experience rather than to physical reality itself. This created a sharp distinction between the objective world studied by science and the subjective world of human experience. However, clearly understanding the essence of material substance did not automatically prove that material substances actually exist. Descartes could conceive clearly and distinctly of extended things without knowing whether any such things exist independently of his thoughts about them. The mere fact that he had coherent ideas about material objects did not guarantee that these ideas corresponded to anything real, rather than being elaborate mental constructions. The evil demon hypothesis remained a logical possibility. Perhaps all his apparent experiences of physical objects were systematically deceptive mental states produced by a malevolent deceiver. Descartes' proof for the existence of the external world proceeded through a complex argument involving the nature of sensory ideas and the causal principles governing the production of ideas in conscious minds. He observed that sensory ideas of material objects appear in consciousness involuntarily and often contrary to his will and expectations. When he opens his eyes in daylight, visual ideas appear automatically without any conscious decision to produce them. When he touches a hot stove, pain sensations occur whether he wants them or not. This involuntary character of sensory experience suggests that these ideas are produced by causes external to his own mind, rather than by his own mental activity. Furthermore, sensory ideas exhibit systematic patterns and regularities that suggest they are produced by stable external causes operating according to consistent laws. Physical objects appear to have permanent characteristics that persist through different acts of observation. They exhibit spatial relationships that remain consistent across different sensory modalities. Objects that look large also feel large when touched, and objects that appear distant also sound faint when they make noise. These patterns would be difficult to explain if sensory ideas were merely random mental constructions rather than systematic responses to external stimuli. Descartes also appealed to the principle that ideas must have adequate causes that contain at least as much reality as the ideas themselves represent. Sensory ideas represent material objects as having objective reality as extended substances. These ideas must therefore be caused by something that actually possesses the reality of extended substance, either by material objects themselves or by some other being that contains at least as much reality as material substance. Since Descartes knew that he himself is essentially a non-extended thinking substance, he cannot be the adequate cause of his own sensory ideas of extended things. The only plausible adequate cause would be actually existing material substances interacting with his body according to mechanical principles. The argument was completed by appealing to divine benevolence. God has given humans a strong natural inclination to believe that their sensory ideas are caused by material objects existing independently of consciousness. If this natural inclination systematically led to false beliefs, then God would be a deceiver, which contradicts divine perfection. Therefore, the external world of material objects must exist more or less as humans naturally believe it to exist. This divine guarantee makes it reasonable to trust the general reliability of sensory experience while remaining cautious about specific sensory judgments that might be mistaken. However, this proof for the external world was more limited in scope than it might initially appear. Descartes argued only that material objects exist as extended substances with geometrical properties, not that they possess all the qualities that sensory experience attributes to them. The proof establishes that there are physical things with sizes, shapes, positions, and motions that cause sensory ideas in conscious observers. But it does not prove that physical things are actually coloured, warm, fragrant, or textured in the ways they appear to be. These secondary qualities remain subjective appearances rather than objective features of material reality. This distinction between primary and secondary qualities had profound implications for understanding the relationship between scientific and ordinary knowledge. Science deals with the primary, mathematically describable qualities of material objects and can therefore achieve objective knowledge that is the same for all rational observers. Ordinary experience deals largely with secondary qualities that vary from observer to observer and therefore cannot provide objective knowledge of material reality. This suggested that scientific knowledge is more fundamental than common-sense knowledge and that progress in understanding nature requires moving beyond the confusions of ordinary sensory experience. Critics of Descartes' argument pointed out several problematic assumptions. The causal principle that ideas must have adequate causes seemed to work well for mathematical ideas, but was more questionable when applied to sensory ideas. Why should sensory ideas of extended things require extended causes, rather than being producible by non-extended mental causes? Furthermore, the appeal to divine benevolence seemed circular, since the existence of God had been proven using principles that themselves depended on trusting clear and distinct ideas. If the reliability of clear and distinct ideas requires divine guarantee, then the proof of God's existence cannot itself depend on assuming the reliability of clear and distinct ideas. More fundamentally, critics questioned whether Descartes had really solved the problem of bridging the gap between subjective experience and objective reality. Even if material objects exist as extended substances, human knowledge of them remains mediated through sensory ideas that may not accurately represent their objective properties. How can we ever know whether our ideas of material objects correspond to the objects themselves, rather than being systematic distortions produced by the interaction between objects and our particular sensory apparatus? This problem of representation would become central to later epistemological debates about the possibility of objective knowledge. Nevertheless, Descartes' analysis of material substance established frameworks that continue to influence scientific thinking. The distinction between primary and secondary qualities became fundamental to modern physics and chemistry. The idea that objective reality consists of mathematically describable properties became central to scientific methodology. The problem of explaining how objective physical processes give rise to subjective conscious experiences remains one of the hardest problems in contemporary philosophy of mind and neuroscience. Descartes' insights about the relationship between the mathematical structure of physical reality and the qualitative richness of conscious experience continue to challenge philosophers and scientists seeking to understand the place of consciousness in the natural world. Part 14. Ethics, Virtue, and the Good Life. Although Descartes is primarily remembered for his contributions to epistemology and metaphysics, his philosophical system included a sophisticated ethical theory that attempted to show how his dualistic understanding of human nature could provide guidance for living well. His approach to ethics was deeply influenced by Stoic philosophy, but modified in light of his mechanistic understanding of the body and his analysis of the passions as psychophysical phenomena. The result was a distinctive moral philosophy that emphasized rational self-control, appropriate emotional response, and the cultivation of intellectual and moral virtues suited to beings who are both rational souls and embodied creatures. Descartes' provisional moral code, outlined in the Discourse on Method, reflected his conviction that practical life cannot wait for the completion of philosophical systems. While engaged in the systematic reconstruction of knowledge, people must continue to make decisions about how to live, and these decisions require some ethical guidance even if ultimate moral truths remain uncertain. His provisional code consisted of 3 main principles designed to ensure reasonable conduct while avoiding the paralysis that might result from excessive moral skepticism. The first principle required obedience to the laws and customs of his country and adherence to the religion in which he had been raised. This conservatism in public matters reflected not moral relativism, but rather practical wisdom about the importance of social stability and the dangers of revolutionary change. Since most moral and political questions admit of reasonable disagreement, it is better to follow established practices than to create social chaos by acting on possibly mistaken private judgments. This principle also reflects Descartes' awareness that moral truth is more difficult to achieve than mathematical truth, and therefore requires greater reliance on collective wisdom embedded in traditional institutions. The second principle demanded firmness and resolution in action once decisions have been made. Even if one's initial judgments about what to do are uncertain or potentially mistaken, it is better to act consistently on those judgments than to waver indecisively between alternatives. Descartes compared this to travellers lost in a forest, who would be better off walking steadily in one direction than wandering aimlessly in circles. This principle recognizes that practical life often requires action under conditions of uncertainty, and that the costs of indecision may be greater than the costs of acting on imperfect information. It also reflects the importance of character development through consistent practice rather than sporadic efforts at moral improvement. The third principle required working to master one's desires and thoughts, rather than trying to change the external world. This principle drew heavily on Stoic teachings about focusing attention on what is within our control rather than lamenting what is beyond our influence. We cannot control natural disasters, other people's decisions, or the ultimate outcomes of our actions, but we can control our responses to these external events. Happiness depends more on developing appropriate attitudes toward circumstances than on achieving particular external outcomes. This principle also reflects Descartes' conviction that the mind has genuine causal power over bodily responses and can therefore influence at least some aspects of emotional and physiological experience. However, Descartes later developed a more systematic ethical theory that went beyond these provisional principles to address fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, virtue and vice, and the ultimate goals of human life. This mature ethical theory was grounded in his analysis of human nature as consisting of both rational soul and mechanical body, requiring a moral philosophy that could guide the appropriate coordination of these different aspects of human existence. The foundation of Cartesian ethics was the principle that good consists in whatever perfects human nature, while evil consists in whatever corrupts or diminishes it. Since humans are essentially rational beings, temporarily united with physical bodies, human good must involve the perfection of both rational and embodied aspects of human existence. The highest good for humans consists in the proper use of free will, choosing to believe only what is clearly and distinctly perceived, and to pursue only what is clearly recognized as genuinely beneficial. This makes intellectual and moral virtue intimately connected. Both involve the disciplined use of rational capacities to achieve appropriate relationship with truth and goodness. Descartes' analysis of the passions provided crucial resources for developing this ethical theory. Since emotions are psychophysical phenomena involving both mental and bodily components, moral development requires understanding how to cultivate appropriate emotional responses rather than simply suppressing emotional response altogether. The goal is not stoic apatheia or complete absence of passion, but rather appropriate passion that responds accurately to the real value and significance of different situations. Fear should be proportionate to genuine dangers, love should be directed towards genuinely lovable objects, and anger should be mobilized only in response to real injustices that can be effectively addressed. This led Descartes to develop what may be the first systematic theory of emotional education and self-regulation. Since emotional patterns are established through repeated associations between bodily movements and mental experiences, they can be gradually modified through conscious practice and habituation. A person who tends towards excessive fear can work to cultivate more appropriate responses by systematically exposing themselves to feared situations while maintaining rational perspective on actual levels of risk. Someone prone to inappropriate anger can develop better emotional control by practicing alternative responses and by working to understand the underlying causes of their reactions. Moral development becomes a matter of conscious psychological engineering guided by rational understanding of human nature and environmental demands. The ultimate goal of Cartesian ethics was the achievement of what he called beatitude, or supreme happiness, which consists in the soul's recognition of its own perfection and its proper relationship to God and creation. This happiness is not dependent on external circumstances or bodily pleasures, but arises from the internal satisfaction of exercising rational and moral capacities appropriately. The person who judges clearly, chooses wisely, and responds emotionally in proportion to genuine values achieves a kind of self-sufficiency that makes them genuinely independent of fortune and circumstance. This supreme happiness is available to anyone who develops proper use of their rational capacities, regardless of their external situation or natural endowments. However, Descartes' ethical theory faced several serious challenges. The emphasis on rational self-control and emotional regulation seemed to underestimate the importance of spontaneity, creativity, and authentic self-expression that many consider essential to human flourishing. The goal of mastering one's desires and thoughts might produce psychological rigidity rather than genuine freedom. Furthermore, the individualistic focus on personal virtue and happiness seemed to neglect the social dimensions of moral life and the responsibilities that arise from living in communities with others. Critics also questioned whether Descartes' dualistic metaphysics could provide adequate foundations for ethics. If minds and bodies are completely different kinds of substance, how can there be genuine moral responsibilities toward embodied beings? If the physical world operates according to purely mechanical principles, what grounds are there for preferring some outcomes over others? The mechanical philosophy seemed to drain the natural world of intrinsic value and purpose, leaving only subjective human preferences as the basis for moral judgment. This threatened to reduce ethics to arbitrary convention rather than objective truth about how rational beings ought to live. Nevertheless, Descartes' ethical innovations established important precedents for later moral philosophy. His emphasis on the connection between intellectual and moral virtue influenced Enlightenment thinkers who believed that moral progress depends on rational understanding. His analysis of emotional regulation anticipated contemporary developments in cognitive behavioral therapy and positive psychology. His conviction that moral truth can be discovered through systematic reflection rather than inherited from tradition became central to modern approaches to normative ethics. Even philosophers who reject his specific conclusions often accept his general approach of grounding ethics in systematic understanding of human nature and rational principles rather than in authority or convention. Part 15. Legacy and Influence on Modern Thought. The influence of Cartesian philosophy on subsequent intellectual development has been so profound and pervasive that it is difficult to imagine what modern thought would look like without it. Descartes established not only specific doctrines and arguments, but also fundamental ways of approaching philosophical problems that continue to shape how we think about knowledge, reality, consciousness, and human nature. Even philosophers who explicitly reject Cartesian conclusions often find themselves responding to questions that Descartes first posed or working within conceptual frameworks that he established. Perhaps most fundamentally, Descartes established what philosophers call the epistemological turn in modern philosophy. Rather than beginning with assumptions about the nature of reality and then asking how we can come to know it, Descartes began with questions about the nature and limits of human knowledge and then used the answers to draw conclusions about reality. This methodological innovation made epistemology or theory of knowledge central to philosophical inquiry in ways that would have seemed strange to ancient and medieval thinkers. The question, how can we know, became logically prior to the question, what exists? And this prioritization continues to influence philosophical methodology today. The method of systematic doubt became one of the most powerful tools in the philosophical toolkit. Even philosophers who reject Descartes' specific skeptical scenarios often employ systematic questioning of assumptions as a way of testing the logical foundations of theories and belief systems. The idea that philosophical progress requires clearing away inherited prejudices and starting fresh with the most basic questions became central to Enlightenment thinking and continues to influence educational philosophy today. Critical thinking courses in contemporary universities often begin by teaching students to question their assumptions in ways that trace back directly to Cartesian method. Descartes' substance dualism, despite facing serious philosophical and empirical challenges, established frameworks for thinking about consciousness that remain influential even among philosophers who reject dualistic conclusions. The distinction between subjective first-person experience and objective third-person description continues to generate what contemporary philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. How does subjective experience arise from objective physical processes? How can we bridge the explanatory gap between neural activity and conscious phenomena? These questions emerge directly from Cartesian insights about the unique nature of conscious experience and its apparent resistance to mechanical explanation. The mind-body problem that Descartes created by his rigorous separation of mental and physical substances continues to drive research programs in neuroscience, psychology, and artificial intelligence. Contemporary cognitive scientists ask whether mental processes can be reduced to computational processes, whether consciousness is an emergent property of complex neural networks, and whether artificial systems could ever achieve genuine understanding rather than mere simulation of intelligent behavior. These questions presuppose Cartesian insights about the distinctive features of mental phenomena while seeking naturalistic explanations that avoid dualistic metaphysics. Descartes' mechanical philosophy provided conceptual foundations for the scientific revolution that transformed human understanding of the natural world. The idea that nature operates according to mathematical laws, discoverable through systematic observation and experimentation, became central to modern scientific methodology. The rejection of teleological explanation in favor of mechanical causation established physics as the fundamental natural science from which other sciences derive their authority. Even life sciences that deal with purposive biological processes generally seek to explain apparent teleology in terms of underlying mechanical processes shaped by evolutionary history. The Cartesian approach to mathematics through coordinate geometry revolutionized mathematical thinking and made possible the development of calculus and modern mathematical physics. By showing how geometric problems could be solved using algebraic methods and how algebraic relationships could be represented spatially, Descartes created the conceptual tools that Newton and Leibniz would use to develop mathematical analysis. Contemporary mathematics continues to rely heavily on coordinate systems and the integration of geometric and algebraic approaches that Descartes pioneered. In psychology, Descartes' analysis of the passions established foundations for scientific study of emotional processes. His emphasis on the psychophysical nature of emotions, the role of early experience in shaping emotional dispositions, and the possibility of emotional regulation through cognitive and behavioral interventions all anticipate contemporary developments in effective neuroscience and clinical psychology. Cognitive behavioral therapy in particular reflects Cartesian insights about the connections between thoughts, emotions and behaviors, even while rejecting dualistic assumptions about the relationship between mind and body. The influence of Cartesian philosophy extended far beyond academic disciplines to shape broader cultural attitudes toward reason, authority, and individual autonomy. The idea that each person should use their own rational capacities to discover truth, rather than accepting beliefs on the basis of tradition or authority, became central to Enlightenment ideals of intellectual and political freedom. Democratic political theory, scientific education and human rights discourse all reflect Cartesian convictions about the dignity and capabilities of individual rational agents. The modern emphasis on critical thinking, evidence-based reasoning and skepticism toward authority claims traces back to methodological principles that Descartes established. However, Cartesian influence has not been uniformly positive, according to many contemporary critics. Feminist philosophers have argued that the emphasis on detached, objective rationality reflects masculine biases and undervalues forms of knowledge that emerge from embodied, relational, and emotional engagement with the world. Environmental philosophers have suggested that the mechanistic worldview contributed to ecological destruction by encouraging humans to see nature as mere raw material for technological manipulation rather than as intrinsically valuable. Postmodern thinkers have questioned whether the quest for absolute foundations and universal truths might conceal power relations and cultural biases rather than achieving genuine objectivity. These criticisms reflect ongoing debates about whether Cartesian approaches to knowledge and reality capture something essential about human rational capacities, or whether they represent historically specific cultural developments that need to be transcended. Some contemporary philosophers argue for developing alternatives to Cartesian frameworks based on embodied cognition, social construction of knowledge, and pragmatic rather than foundational approaches to truth. Others maintain that criticisms of Cartesian rationality often misunderstand its actual content, and that properly understood, Cartesian insights remain essential for any adequate understanding of knowledge, consciousness, and human nature. The debates themselves, however, testify to the continuing relevance of questions that Descartes first posed systematically. Whether we accept or reject his specific answers, we cannot avoid grappling with problems about the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality, the nature of rational justification, the possibility of certain knowledge, and the place of consciousness in the natural world. These problems define much of the agenda for contemporary philosophy of mind, epistemology, and philosophy of science. In this sense, we remain Cartesians even when we think we have moved beyond Cartesian philosophy. Perhaps most importantly, Descartes established the ideal of philosophy as systematic rational inquiry that can achieve results comparable in certainty and universal validity to mathematics. While few contemporary philosophers share his optimism about achieving complete systematic knowledge, most continue to pursue philosophical questions with methods that emphasize conceptual clarity, logical rigor, and systematic argumentation. The vision of philosophy as a discipline that can make genuine progress in understanding fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, and value continues to motivate philosophical research even among those who reject foundationalist epistemology and dualistic metaphysics. René Descartes gave modern thought both its characteristic problems and its characteristic methods for addressing those problems. His legacy consists not only in specific doctrines that he defended, but in a style of philosophical thinking that emphasizes systematic doubt, conceptual analysis, and the primacy of rational reflection over inherited authority. Whether this legacy ultimately proves liberating or constraining for human understanding remains an open question that each generation of thinkers must answer for themselves. But there can be no doubt that understanding contemporary intellectual culture requires grappling seriously with the Cartesian revolution that helped create the modern world.